This is Rummy's Corner. Good evening, boxing fans, and welcome back to the latest installment of the Top 10 by Decade scoring experiment. In part 1, we started with the heavyweight division, and we have worked our way south from there, going through the cruiserweights, the light heavyweights, the super middleweights, the middleweights, the junior middleweights, and today in part 7, it's the welterweight division. Once again, we will be utilizing Ring Magazine's rich archive of historical rankings in order to try and objectively determine the top 10 welterweight boxers from each decade. Ring Magazine began doing annual rankings for the welterweight division way back in 1924. So for our purposes here, we are going to start with the first full decade with a complete data set of rankings. The 1930s. At the conclusion of 1930, these were the top-rated welterweights according to Ring Magazine. Tommy Freeman was the champion, so he receives 10 points for being the first name on the list. Next up is young Corbett III, and he gets 9 points. We continue allocating points in this fashion until we reach the 10th name on the list, which is Paulie Walker, and he gets 1 point. Note that Sammy Jackson is the 11th name on the list, and he gets nothing. We're only concerned with the first 10 names on any given list. If we go ahead and do this for every year from 1930 through 1939, the final result looks like this. Jimmy McLarnin finished first with an impressive 61-point total. He was consistently viewed among the very best welterweights throughout most of the decade, and he had a comfortable lead over Seferino Garcia. Looking at third place Barney Ross, he actually defeated McLarnin in 2 of their 3 bouts, and he also defeated Garcia in all 3 of their matches. But as you can see here, Ross was considered the best over just a 3-year stretch. And I say this as a reminder that this scoring system is about being regarded among the best of a weight class across an entire decade, and that head-to-head considerations, they play no part in the scoring. Moving on to the 1940s, Sugar Ray Robinson finished with a terrific 75-point score. In the previous divisions we explored from the 1940s, the guy who finished first was champion during the years when the titles were frozen during World War II. But that wasn't the case here with Robinson, so he didn't benefit from the inherent World War II bias in the scoring system. Freddie Cochran was the one who actually greatly benefited under the scoring system during the time when the titles were frozen. So I think it's worth noting that Sugar Ray's hefty total isn't skewed in the same way, for example, that Tony Zales was at middleweight. So a very strong showing here from Sugar Ray Robinson. Looking at the 1950s, Kid Gavilan topped the list with an even 50 points. This was the second consecutive decade that Kid Gavilan finished as a top 10 welterweight, and he was viewed as one of the very best in the class throughout the first half of the 50s. Johnny Bratton edged out Carmen Basilio for second place, and looking through these numbers, you could see that no one was ranked in the top 10 for more than 6 years. And that was just the case for Gavilan and Saxton, so Kid Gavilan had the best score here. In the 1960s, Luis Rodriguez finished first with 59 points. Emil Griffith finished second with 53 points, and looking at the numbers, you could see that Griffith was considered the best over a 4-year period, whereas Rodriguez was never considered the best. He was just considered among the best for a slightly longer stretch of time at welterweight. Griffith also defeated Rodriguez in 3 of their 4 bouts, but head-to-head results don't factor into the scoring, and Rodriguez basically just had a longer stay in the division. It's also worth noting that this is the 3rd top 10 list on which Griffith has appeared. He was also considered a top 10 middleweight in both the 1960s and the 70s. Moving ahead to the welterweights from the 1970s, Jose Napoli's finished first with a 58-point total, and he was viewed as the best, or the second best, over a nice 6-year stretch. Clyde Gray was second place with 47 points, and Pepino Cuevas finished a distant third from there with 33. There are some really good names here, but none of them had a particularly long run as a welterweight during this time. Napoli's was undoubtedly the dominant welterweight force in the early to mid-70s, so him finishing first here with a nice score makes a lot of sense to me. Then looking at the 1980s, Marlon Starling finished first with 58 points. Starling was viewed among the very best throughout most of the 80s, and he had a fairly comfortable lead over Milton McCrory, who tallied 43 points. Down at the bottom, tied for 10th place, we have Sugar Ray Leonard. You can see here that he was viewed as the best welterweight at the conclusion of 1980 and the conclusion of 1981, but he barely made the list because he didn't spend very much time competing as a welterweight. His reign had actually started in the late 70s, but at the end of the day, Leonard was only ranked as a year-end top 10 welterweight by Ring a total of 4 times. He was considered the best welterweight at the end of 3 of those 4 years, but it was still only 4 welterweight appearances for Leonard. So Ray was never going to have a strong finish under this type of a scoring system because he had several retirements and long stretches of inactivity, and he also started moving up in weight. Moving on to the 1990s, Felix Tito Trinidad finished first with 63 points, which was just enough to edge out Sweet Pea, who had 61. Whitaker was considered the best for a longer stretch of time, but Trinidad was considered among the top 3 for an even longer period. So there's very little separating those two here. And then we have Ike Corte finishing with a solid 52-point total. This is the first time we have seen 3 welterweights break the 50-point barrier in any given decade. And indeed, it's the first time we've seen this type of thing in a while. So those are some really good scores for those top 3 guys here. And then we have some other quality guys on this list, like Buddy McGirt and Oscar De La Hoya. So there was some pretty good talent at welterweight during the 90s. On to the double O's. Whoa. Antonio Margarito finished first with an excellent score of 67 points. This came as quite a surprise to me, because Margarito was only really viewed as the best for a very short spell following his victory over Cotto. But looking at the numbers, Margarito was viewed as a top welterweight for 8 out of 10 years. Mosley finished second here with an impressive 51-point total, and he spent most of the decade split between 147 and 154. The other surprise here for me was seeing Damgard was held in such high regard by Ring for so many years. And then Floyd Mayweather Jr., he wasn't really at the weight class for very long during this decade, and that gap you see by his name in 2008 was from his short-lived retirement. But wow, that's a hell of a score from Margarito. And now, even though the current decade is not yet complete, through the end of 2017, the list looks like this. Manny Pacquiao leads the pack with 61 points. Kell Brook is second with 52 points, and then Floyd Mayweather Jr. stands at 48. So mathematically, this looks like it's more or less a 2-man race between Pacquiao and Brook. But nothing is set in stone here, so we will just have to wait and see how the next 2 years play out before anything is finalized. So looking at the most dominant welterweight decades, Sugar Ray Robinson had the highest total with 75 points from the 1940s. And then, amazingly, the second highest score from any decade was Antonio Margarito. He had 67 points in the double O's. What a shocking revelation. Next we have Felix Trinidad from the 90s. Then we have a 3-way tie between McLaurin from the 30s, Sweet Pea from the 90s, and Pac-Man from the current decade. Rodriguez from the 60s, then a tie between Napoli's from the 70s and Starling from the 80s, and closing out we have Griffith from the 60s. In total, we had 7 different welterweights who finished top 10 in multiple decades. The 2 standouts here are Jose Napoli's and Kid Gavilan. They're the only 2 welterweights who appeared in multiple top 10 lists that had one first place finish in a given decade. Now, if we add up all of the numbers from all of the welterweights who finished top 10 during the decades we covered, our final results look like this. Jose Napoli's topped the list with 83 points. Then Mayweather Jr. edged out Sugar Ray Robinson. Next we have Kid Gavilan, and there he is again, Antonio Margarito. Beyond the names on this list here, the thing that surprised me most is that in the rich history of the welterweight division, there wasn't a single welterweight who topped the 100-point mark. With the other original weight classes we've covered so far, heavyweights, light heavyweights, middleweights, there have always been at least 2 guys who finished with over 100 points. But here we are, in the welterweight division, and no one really came close to 100 points. At a quick glance, it just seems to me that the most logical explanation here is that the greatest of the greats who have passed through the welterweight division, that they tended to change divisions far more frequently than the guys up north. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed. Please stay tuned for part 8 of the Top 10 by Decade series. Up next, the Junior Welterweight Division. Until then, have a great night.